In 2021, Hironobu Sakaguchi's MISTWALKER released a brand new full-length RPG called Fantasian exclusively on iOS devices through Apple's Apple Arcade subscription service. Since then, that's been the only way to experience the game, at least until this year with the upcoming release of Fantasian Neo Dimension, an upgraded re-release for console and PC. Square-Enix provided me with a review copy, and over the last few days I've sunk my teeth into what this game has to offer. To be clear, while I am a good ways into the game, I'm calling this an early review because this game is significantly longer than I expected it to be. That being said, I'm limiting the footage in this review to the first few hours of the game in the interest of keeping spoilers to a minimum. This game is a linear, turn-based narrative RPG adventure featuring Leo, an amnesiac young man who seeks to uncover the mysterious circumstances surrounding his memory loss. The big draw for this game is obviously its visuals, because nearly every environment in the game is a representation of a real-life diorama model that was scanned in and adapted as an explorable location, and it's a concept that sounds kinda ridiculous on paper, but it's executed nearly flawlessly. There's a huge variety of intricately detailed maps that you can tell were made by all sorts of different people with slightly different stylistic touches, but this blend of varied styles isn't disjointed, but rather it's part of the appeal. The setting for this game is a mixture of classic fantasy mixed with a healthy dose of futuristic sci-fi and pretty much anything in between. You'll find everything from a quaint village bordering a massive forest to a giant futuristic city with its smooth, shiny metal floors and glowing industrial machinery in every direction. The dioramas are also not limited by reality, as many of these maps have interactive and animated elements, creating a blend of both physical and digital artistry that leads to an at times breathtaking visual style. The diorama maps are genuinely amazing, but the caveat is that scaling them up to a huge screen like the one that I played on, at least compared to the iOS devices that this game was only available for, will reveal some visual flaws that may have otherwise gone unnoticed on those devices. At times, the game can zoom in the camera, making some of the backgrounds lose a bit of their clarity, or sometimes you'll see a strange, almost artifacting of the environment's geometry. Fortunately, these flaws are few and far between, and I actually only noticed most of them when I was going back over the footage for this review. During normal gameplay, there's enough detail and variety to these environments that any flaws are outweighed by the impressiveness and novelty of exploring these locales, especially knowing that they were handcrafted. The characters, on the other hand, are your standard 3D characters, but they fit in surprisingly well to these real environments with their stylized, almost clay-like color schemes. They look great in motion, especially in the fully in-engine cutscenes, which are beautifully directed. Also, this new release adds full voice acting to the core cast and some of the roaming NPCs, with seemingly new mouth movements to match. Additionally, the game has a narrative structure that includes these extended storybook-style cutscenes with narration and a variety of illustrations. This is actually a really great aesthetic and storytelling device, and it reminds me a lot of Lost Odyssey, another MISTWALKER game, but it definitely contributes to the length of the game. And yeah, to go back to what I said earlier, this game is pretty long, and the cutscenes are numerous. If you're a fan of older style JRPGs like the earlier Final Fantasies like I am, you'll feel right at home with this. But if you're someone who's not a fan of extended dialogue, tons of text boxes, and lulls of story development between the little bits of action, you might find yourself becoming exasperated at times. Again, for me personally, this is actually a feature and something that makes me enjoy the game more, but with attention spans becoming shorter all the time, I do think this might lose some people if they're not already invested in the story. The soundtrack is a full suite of brand new music from the legendary Nobuo Uematsu, and it delivers at every turn. It's really unique in its mixture of standard fantasy fare, but with hybrid melodies sprinkled in that utilize 80s retro-style synth. The best comparison I could make is that a lot of tracks feel like Final Fantasy IX meets the never-ending story. So much so that I genuinely think those two things specifically might have actually been influences on some of the particular compositions. But there's really a wide blend of genres on offer here, and it's really enjoyable to experience Uematsu at full steam for an entire RPG again. New to this re-release is the option to also change the in-battle music to a number of previous Final Fantasy titles, each offering a different song that parallels each of the game's original battle themes. This is a nice way to add variety to the soundtrack and keep it feeling fresh, especially since you can randomize it, but despite the game using the original soundtrack for the important encounters, I still left the option off for the sake of wanting to experience the original new tracks and not miss anything. Given that this game was originally built around a mobile device's form factor, the controls and interface are pretty obviously still styled in a sort of minimalist, touch-oriented style, and at least at a glance seem entirely unchanged from the original release. But fortunately, controller support is integrated seamlessly. It's still very functional and works incredibly well with controller input, but the mobile-friendly interface is still apparent and might be a turnoff for some. For me, I actually enjoy how sleek and minimalist it is, especially given how much more cluttered it could have been with a more traditional interface. Plus, standard battle actions are mapped to the controller buttons, specifically the triggers, for ease of access without the need to navigate menus to access your most recently used skills and items. However, this is a fixed perspective game with a dynamic moving camera in certain transition areas, which actually makes for a really cool camera transition effect, but at the cost of some awkward at times control issues with the analog stick specifically. The game remembers which direction you were pressing before the camera turns, meaning if you're holding left to run left and the camera rotates behind Leo, he'll now be running forward while you're still holding left on the analog stick. This led me to quite a number of awkward fights with the controls where my immersion was totally shattered, because I either had to completely stop moving for a second to readjust, or I just had to rewire my brain on the fly for the small segments when I didn't want to let go of the analog stick. This might not make a whole lot of sense to people who haven't played older fixed perspective JRPGs, but those who have might have an idea of what I'm talking about here. And I thought this was a solved problem nowadays. This re-release has two difficulties, normal and hard, whereas I believe the original only had a single difficulty that, if I understand correctly, was simply pretty hard. So far in my experience, I haven't had any fights or encounters that felt unfair or unbalanced, but I still have a ways to go in this game and your mileage may vary, on the normal difficulty at least. And of course, the turn-based battle system works kind of how you'd expect an RPG turn-based battle system to work, but only on the surface. You can see your turn order, and you can take turns one at a time using a mixture of attacks, spells, and items. But what sets this apart from other RPGs is the way you land attacks. Every attack has a direction or arc, and some attacks can be adjusted dynamically to pierce through multiple enemies. This leads to some really creative encounters where you have to really think about how you orient your abilities to deal the most damage to the enemy formation, shaping your attacks to hit as many as possible. And it's a really entertaining twist on the classic turn-based formula. My only real nitpick is that I do wish you could adjust the sensitivity of the analog stick's movement to the targets, because making even tiny adjustments feels like it leads to massive movements, which has more than once caused me to completely mess up the attack and hit the wrong enemies. You can use your mouse to control these movements, but having to switch between the controller and the mouse is not ideal. Another unique twist is the dimengeon mechanic. The game has random encounters as you explore the world, but you can optionally activate a device that basically saves each encounter for later. Once you're ready to clear out your backlog of enemies, you can initiate a fight against the full number of diverted enemies, leading to kind of sort of a risky situation if you let it get too full. This is a really great way of modernizing the random encounter mechanics of the genre without outright removing them. Being able to freely explore the world without the worry of commencing a battle, at least temporarily, is such a freeing feeling that it's actually gonna be kinda hard to go back to some of the other games that don't have something like this. I don't want to talk about the story in too much detail for the sake of keeping this video spoiler free, but I did want to give a couple of impressions. The amnesia mystery is intriguing and shockingly not that tropey here. In fact, it almost goes out of its way to subvert some of the tropes I expected to encounter, but not so obviously that it's ham-fisted or that I could easily predict what's gonna happen next. Plus, the voice acting is just great all around, and some of these story moments, especially with the storybook-styled artwork narration scenes, are really moving and entertaining. The game has a mostly serious tone, but with moments of levity and even sometimes comedy. Overall, I think this game is exactly the kind of thing a lot of people are looking for right now. The team behind it are clearly wanting to recapture the glory days of the genre without simply retreading it, and I think they did a fantastic job of towing that line. If you have experience with turn-based RPGs, you'll feel right at home with this, because it's very easy to understand and its mechanics are simple enough to grasp even for someone new to the genre, but complex enough to offer a depth that makes it equally challenging and rewarding. You've got your world map, your towns, your shops, your item and equipment management, and your random encounters, but it still somehow feels fresh all the time thanks to clever twists to basically every classic element, from the gameplay to the visuals. Fantasian Neo Dimension is a love letter to the JRPG genre, and its origins as a mobile title don't stop MISTWALKER and Square-Enix from firing on all cylinders to deliver an expansive emotional journey. This is a game that I'm confident most classic RPG fans will enjoy, and I think that even people not super into the genre can still enjoy it too, thanks to how fun the mechanics are. Before I go, I want to give a huge thanks to my patrons and channel members, including That's Ash, and They're Taking the Megos to Isengard, along with all the wonderful people you see on your screen. Thank you so much for your support, and thank you, person watching, for sticking around. I'll see you very soon for a big ol' retrospective, and until then, have a fantastic day.